Hi there, my name's Shane, and in this video I'm going to be trying something new, and that's going to be talking about a trip that I went on last October to the mouth of the St. Lawrence River through Quebec. It's a part of the country I never had explored before this trip, and in this video I'm excited to share the route that I took, the gear that I packed, and share some of the photos in the video that I captured along the way. When I started planning this trip, I hoped to have head out earlier in the fall, but unfortunately just because of my full-time work, I wasn't able to get time off until the middle/end of October. So I departed when the leaves had already pretty much all fallen from the trees and the weather was quite a bit colder, but it is what it is. I kept my route very simple, and it was simply just going to head up along the north of the St. Lawrence River, heading past Quebec City and then heading north a little bit to Saguenay, heading back down, taking a ferry across the St. Lawrence River, continuing up it to Gaspé, and then heading back down again. I plan to take around 10 days for the trip, and for the majority of it, I hope to sleep in my car, and it just is set up to be like a miniature camper. It's my Subaru Outback that I've shown a couple times on this channel already. With regards to the camera gear that I took, I'd like to say I was minimalistic. I wasn't, but I took less than I normally would, and I just had along my Sony A1 with my trusty 24-70. Alongside that, a 12-24mm for all the kind of landscape and wide angle shots that I wanted. And then in case I saw any wildlife, I lugged around my 200-600mm. In spoilers, I didn't see many animals, so this was a lot of weight that I carried around for not a lot of photos. Alongside these, I took my drone and a 360 camera, which was just for fun and to get kind of some aerial photos. Starting the trip off though, I departed early on a Sunday morning, and my goal was simple for that day, and that is to make it as far as I could away from home. I took a familiar route along the shores of Lake Ontario towards the mouth of the St. Lawrence, and thankfully I pretty much hit no traffic, and the weather conditions were fantastic as I just breezed through Toronto and Oshawa. And I only had one stop planned for the day, just to make my dinner and then to continue on to Quebec City. When I did stop to make dinner, I did so at the Long Sault Scenic Parkway, which I had never been to before, and is just a road that goes through a series of islands. And I imagine in the summer this must be a super popular camping location, but when I was there was pretty much no one there, and the only traffic that was going through was just probably people taking a scenic drive, which I highly recommend. It's just a really cool spot. And I just parked on this kind of neat little road that led into the water, and I popped my drone up in the air just to see what it looked like, and it was really cool because there must have been more roads connecting these islands, or at least old roads, and their foundations might have given away, or they had fallen on poor maintenance, and they just now lead into nowhere, into the water. And from above you can kind of see the skeletons of these old pathways, which was really interesting. So I prepared my dinner here and got to watch a nice sunset before I continued on, just kind of close to Quebec City where my first destination was planned for the next morning, and I just parked at a truck stop just to sleep for the night, to keep it simple. The next morning I awoke, made my coffee, and continued on to my next destination, which was St. Matthew Provincial Park. But unfortunately, upon arriving there, I found it was completely gated off. I was expecting perhaps that the facilities would be closed and the trails would be having no maintenance, but they were not messing around, and they completely had the road stopped. So I couldn't get in, which was a little disappointing to say the least. So I made the best of it and went on a nearby hike and just kind of continued on, taking some photos and flying my drone as I meandered my way towards the Jacques Cartier Park, where I planned to sleep for the next 2 nights. But little did I know this was just the beginning of a series of unfortunate events that would befall upon me. Upon arriving at the park, I was expecting perhaps the leaves to be on the ground and it to look rather winterish, but the clouds decided to roll in, making the whole area appear to be somewhat of a desolate wasteland. And unfortunately, the further I went into the park, the more it started to look like rain. So I didn't go on a really big hike that I was hoping to do to the summit of one of the, not mountains, but really big hills there, just because I didn't want to get stuck in a downpour. So I did a couple smaller hikes and flew my drone a little bit, but ultimately the rain did come. So I went back to the site that I had booked, which really just was a parking lot for RVs, but I was expecting perhaps to have facilities nearby, or water or power, but it had none of those. So it was pretty much just a parking lot, but I got to pay for this parking lot, which really filled me with a lot of buyer's remorse, but it is what it is. So I made myself some butter chicken, watched a documentary, and went into my car hoping that the next morning perhaps the weather would turn around. But unfortunately, it did not. So when I awoke the next morning, I had a decision to make, because my plans for the day were to explore Jacques Cartier Park and to go on some hikes and go driving in my car on maybe some more off-roady trails. But unfortunately, with the weather as it was, I couldn't really safely do either of those, or at least do so comfortably. So I made the decision to call it quits on staying in the park that night again, seeing as my campsite was rubbish. So I might as well just go driving as far as I could to find a new place to visit and explore what I could in my car. As I continued on the road towards Saguenay, I really had pretty limited visibility because of the rain, and I enjoyed most of it just by listening to my book. I did make a few stops along the way, probably one of the best ones being actually back towards the St. Lawrence River at Tadoussac. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing the name of these towns wrong. I tried my best, but I'm pretty terrible. But this is just a little kind of port town that has a ferry to take you across the Saguenay River. So it has quite a bit of traffic flowing through it, but isn't really a big town, though the houses and the infrastructure here had a lot of kind of like older designs and it was really pretty. I got out of my vehicle here though and went on a little hike along the shoreline just to see it. And I really would love to come back here someday, because a little ways down the road, there's a place called Les Dunes. And I couldn't really get any good photos of it, but essentially it just was these massive sand dunes and like, well, not cliffs, like sandy hills going into the St. Lawrence, which is a really interesting kind of land formation, because in Ontario and most of Quebec that I'm aware of, we don't really have sand dunes. So it was really neat to see in a freshwater environment like this. But with the rain and everything, I didn't get the best look. So hopefully one day I'll come back here to check it out in the summertime. From there though, I simply continued up the St. Lawrence along the one road, going from town to town. And eventually I stopped at a car rest area and I made myself some ramen, bundled up in my car, and watched the season finale of Game of Thrones, hoping yet again that the next day would hold some better weather. But it actually started raining harder and it did not stop that night. And I think this is a relevant time in the video to mention I departed on this trip with a pretty significant handicap to my vehicle, and that is that I was missing a window. During the summer, unfortunately, my vehicle was broken into while I was working a night shift, and the person didn't simply just break the glass, they also damaged my door frame. So it was taking months for the repair to actually happen. And I made myself just kind of this metal window with a vapor barrier, but there was a really little crack along the weather sealing at the top of the door because of this, which by this point in the trip was becoming a serious issue, letting just a small trickle of moisture into my vehicle that, as the time went on, turned into a rather significant amount of humidity inside my car, making it rather cold and uncomfortable. And it hadn't let up the whole trip, so I had a rather wet interior to my car, which I was getting pretty nervous about. But there was nothing I could really do besides use my heated blanket and bundle up for the night and hope that it would get better. At this point in the trip, to say the least, I was pretty bummed out and the weather had really gotten to me. And I was considering heading back, but realistically, unfortunately, the fastest way home was to actually take the ferry that I had booked the next day and head home from there, because if I were to head back on the route that I took, it would have taken longer. So I just had to wait it out. So I decided I was going to bundle up, throw my rain jacket on, and see how far I can make it along the shoreline before I hit saturation point through my Gore-Tex weather sealing. And in hindsight, some of the photos that I took this morning were actually pretty decent, though in the moment I never really appreciated the location for what it was. And hopefully next time I'm in a situation like this, I can be a little bit more appreciative for what I had, because realistically, it was still an interesting condition in a place that was absolutely beautiful, but I just couldn't really see the forest through the trees there. But thankfully, this was the last day of the terrible weather, and with nothing to lose, I decided to do a bit of off-roading because I was very bored, and I found a campsite on this kind of beachy forest area along a water reservoir, which was actually really cool. And I made myself some pasta, sat in my car for the night, and edited some of the photos I'd taken. And when I woke up the next morning, I had a sunrise. Upon actually seeing the sun, I was incredibly excited. And I took some photos of my car on the beach, made myself a nice breakfast, and then headed back towards St. George, where the ferry was departing from. I went on a little hike here, which was really the longest one I went on the trip so far, and got some fun photos. Nothing too stellar, but it was really refreshing to be able to get out of the vehicle and have some fresh air, and let alone also air my vehicle out from all the moisture inside it. But as I kind of meandered around the area, I popped in at a cafe where a very kind woman let me know of a waterfall a little past town, and I had enough time to visit it before my departure time. So I went over there, and upon embarking on a short hike there was a kind physician who let me know of a very quick way to get down to the waterfall that was there. So thankfully I went to check it out as well, and this was such a cool spot that I wouldn't have found unless they told me about it. So I'm very grateful for both of those individuals who made my day, really. And at this point in the trip, pretty much made the trip worthwhile. I got some nice photos with my camera and drone, and yeah, it was an awesome adventure. I made my way back to town though, and was low-key super excited because I'd never been on a ferry in my car before, and I like boats, so it was kind of fun. As I got onto the ferry, I was giddy, and I went onto the upper deck, and it was quite cold, but thankfully I had the place basically to myself because only a couple other people ended up coming up top there, and I purposely booked the ferry so that I'd be on it during the sunset. And I was very happy with how some of these photos turned out. The combination of the sunlight from golden hour along with kind of the oranges of the deck and the blues of the water in the boat made for some really fun edits, and I'm really happy with these photos. Even though they're nothing too special, it just was really special to me. And I was in very high spirits, and to kind of spoil myself, I ended up booking a hotel, which was very much so needed at this point because of the last 3 nights in my car with all that moisture. I was not smelling the best, and I was in dire need of a shower. So I slept very comfortably that night and awoke the next morning to continue on my journey. With the better weather, I was super excited, and I had very simple plans for the day. I was going to head up along the south shore of the St. Lawrence towards the Gaspé Peninsula, where I had an Airbnb actually booked. And I was going to make as many stops as I could along the way, and I certainly did. The first place I went to was this kind of wind farm with all these turbines, and I love wind farms, so it was really cool. And they had one really big one there that was like a vertical fin. I'd never seen a design like that before, but it was really cool to see. I never really got a good photo of it, but some of the photos in the video that I took here I was really happy with, and it was a great first stop for the day. As I continued on though, I found many lighthouses, and the road was really cool because it kind of was meandering along the actual shore. I imagine in the winter this place must be horrendous for driving, but at the time that I was, it was really interesting. and there's almost no traffic, so I had a very relaxing drive while I listened to my book still. And I found a really neat lighthouse. It was just red, but I kind of got a photo looking up at it with the speckled sky behind it, and it's one of my favorite photos that I took this trip. I really like how kind of the pastel colors turned out with it. And I took the opportunity here to fly my drone again, looking back at the road I went down, and it was fun to see kind of like the little cars snake along it. And there were so many little towns I traveled through here, all of which just sort of like had a church and little old homes, and it just was neat to see. It's kind of like its own world, and they're really isolated from anywhere else with only one road to and from them. So yeah, really cool. I made it to my destination faster than I anticipated though, and I decided I was gonna head actually into the park that I hope to do the next day, which was Ferillion National Park, which is why I actually went on this trip, because I got a free national park pass from Subaru Canada and I wanted to use it. So this was naturally the closest park to go to. So I head into the park, and actually on my drive in, I saw my first real animal for the trip, and it was a fox along the side of the road. I know it wasn't the most scenic location to take some photos, but I was really excited, and it was nice to see some healthy wildlife. But my little stop here slowed me down quite a bit, and I needed to recover some time. So once I got to the parking lot where I was going to hike from, I packed up all my gear, and I think I summited that hill the fastest I've ever done any hill climb in my life. And by the time I reached the top, I was very out of breath, and I thought I was going to pass out with all that elevation covered. And yeah, a little scary, but the sights up there were absolutely breathtaking. It was really cathartic to be able to head up here and get the photos I was really excited for, because ultimately I saw a photo from this park years ago and I always wanted to go here. So being able to actually stand there and kind of take it all in was just, yeah, really rewarding. And I head back to my Airbnb after that. As I started off the day, I was really happy because my plans for the day were finally gonna work out flawlessly. I just had a couple hikes planned, but I just headed back into Ferillion Park and started on them. The first one wasn't technically very difficult. It just was basically straight away to the tip of the peninsula, and it gave a great opportunity to kind of see the whole area and get some neat photos with the focal lengths that I had with me. And more over the last year in particular, I've gotten a lot more comfortable relying on my 24-70 for the majority of my shots, because in the past I do prefer using prime lenses, but I found that just switching lenses it's just too much a lot of the time, especially with the inclement weather I've been experiencing, particularly around this trip. I found having a reliable zoom is a lot more invaluable than I traditionally had thought. And especially pairing that with the 12-24 millimeter, I can get the really interesting shots with my ultra wide lens, while the more traditional reliable shots are delivered on my mid-range zoom. The one thing I do regret though is lugging around my 200-600. I maybe got like 5 photos on this, and they were fun, but I certainly got a good workout taking it with me. But the hike here was really cool, and I was very happy throughout the day and got a lot of great photos that I'm sharing with you now. There was one hike that I went kind of in the bay, just along this kind of sandy beachish boardwalk area. And it was cool, just outside the town of Gaspé. And it had a lot of like cruise ships heading in and out of here. I don't know where they went, but there's a remarkable amount of boat traffic for this time of year, which I didn't expect. I finished the day by wandering through the town of Gaspé, though I didn't take a ton of photos here. I was very excited to head back to my Airbnb, not because I was going to sleep, but I was actually finally going to go out and get some astrophotography because the conditions were finally right. I didn't get any great time lapses this night because I think there was a little bit of humidity in the air. I couldn't really tell, but the photos turned out a little bit hazy and I couldn't quite get some great Milky Way shots, but Nonetheless, I got some fun photos, particularly of a lighthouse nearby that turned out pretty good. But I ended up heading back to the Airbnb once I couldn't feel my toes anymore, and I woke up early the next morning to catch sunrise at the exact same spot. And I was treated to actually seeing some more animals, and this time it was some seals, though they were very content not to move. So I just got some photos and video of them on the one rock they stayed on the entire time. And I got a few shots of the sunrise here, and it just was a nice kind of last morning to spend in the park. And I was just like blown away by how pretty this park was. You could spend a month here and still have photos to be taken. It's just so beautiful. I highly recommend checking it out if you're in the area, though it is rather difficult to get to, granted, because it's basically a detour from any place you want to go to. So it's almost worth making it its own dedicated trip like I did, just because unless it's a destination to go to, it's not really on the way anywhere. With that said though, there still is one really neat location to check out if you're on the peninsula, and that's the town of Pierce. Not because the town is really that spectacular, don't get me wrong, it's beautiful and it has a lot of really fun old buildings, but the land formations in the area are what's to see here. And it's, again, cliffs, but there's a really cool outcropping of land here. And they made a pier, and you actually can go take a ferry across to an island nearby. Unfortunately, the ferry was closed for the season, which is totally fair, again, as they're at the very end of the year. But I was still able to get some neat photos of this outcropping of rock. And there's a little hole in the bottom of it and a spire next to it, and it's just really pretty. One thing I didn't know was they actually have a cool little like suspension bridge outlook thing up on the hill behind it. So I didn't know about this until I got there, but it wasn't too far of a hike. So I went up top, and I, again, was pretty much the only person here. So I had the place to myself to get some photos and video. And it was a really breathtaking view yet again. And I was happy with this little unplanned destination to visit. But I headed back to camp, made myself a little dinner, and waited for the sun to go down because I planned to head out again that night to get some photos of the stars. I didn't get any great wide-angle shots here, but I got some interesting ones by shooting a little more telephoto. Lately, I've been using the 24-70 to get a little bit faster time lapses because the relative motion of the stars between shots with a tighter focal length is obviously greater. So you can get traditionally time lapses that would take 3 hours in a span of whatever, half an hour, which is obviously advantageous. But the quality is obviously going to be lower because you're pushing the settings pretty hard on your camera. Though with the A1 and the A7S III, I find you can crank that ISO really darn high and get salvageable photos. So yeah, I'm really happy with how my one time lapse turned out from here, and it's probably one of the best astro time lapses I've taken so far, and I'm excited to try this out again in the future. I did end up staying out quite a bit longer after I took the time lapse, but unfortunately none of the photos I took turned out particularly well. But I really enjoyed my time sitting there and just watching the stars go by, which was nice because for once I wasn't freezing. But I did make the bold decision the next morning to head out yet again, and this time I got my feet a little bit wet by walking through the water a little ways to get to a part of the beach that was obstructed by one of the outcroppings of rock, even during low tide. But I was very happy with the photos that I got here. I ended up using a various amount of ND filters, but I think some of the best shots came with the 10-stop ND, dragging the exposure quite long. Though I ended up actually shooting in HDR here just to pull out that dynamic range because the contrast between the shadows of the rock and the sky were just so great that I figured an HDR would turn out the best, and I'm quite happy with the results because normally I don't edit HDR photos often, and it's not particularly a strong suit of mine, but nonetheless they had a real painterly aesthetic with all that blurring from the long exposure paired with that really great dynamic range that was almost surreal when editing. So they might look a little fake, but I'm happy with how they turned out. But this was a little bit bittersweet because after this morning was when I started embarking on my trip back home. And actually the weather started getting a little less pleasant this day, so it was kind of suiting to be heading back while it was a little overcast. And the drive along the other side of the peninsula, heading back towards the mainland, wasn't as pretty as the north side. So I didn't make many stops here. My end destination for the day, though, was Bic Provincial Park, which is along the south shore of the St. Lawrence. So I had to cross the peninsula to get there. And it was kind of a battle against the clock because it was quite a long ways away from where I started. But I did make it there in time to catch the sunset and was rewarded with definitely the best sunset of the trip, hands down. The photos here, well, you can see it. It was like, even without editing, the sky was red. It was so cool. And I ended up flying my drone a little bit here as well. And there was a marshland right beside where I was. It was really cool though to see the red reflection of the sky coming into these small tidal pools, giving like little spotted red dots on the ground. Yeah, in between the haze, that gave a really great sense of depth as the hills had a different gradient of light and dark on them the further away that they were. It just was breathtaking and was a great last sunset to see of the trip, because from here I just ended up heading a little bit further that night, but none of the photos that I took were really keepers for the rest of the trip, and I made my way home the next day. So overall, it was a great last evening to spend watching the sunset and just kind of reminiscing on the trip so far and how it really ended stronger than it started. Overall though, this was an awesome trip to go on. Maybe not for all the reasons that I expected, because I always plan out my trips quite well in the sense that I have a lot of destinations I want to go to, and I know enough from previous adventures I've been on that you got to roll with the punches, and if something doesn't work out, you have to have contingency plans. But I've never been beaten down so hard by a sequence of unfortunate events. And like, I had 3 days where nothing went right, and I never had experienced so much rubbish before. And it really got me down, but I got through it, and I definitely learned a lot from it. And the rest of the trip was absolutely awesome, and it was so worthwhile to be able to experience the places that I went to. And I'm really happy with the photos that I got, and I'm really thankful I was able to share them with you in this video. If you have any questions about anywhere I went to, the gear that I used, or want to know more specifics about the spots I visited, I'd love to share it with you. Please feel free to leave a comment below. And if you have any locations you particularly liked, I'd love to know. I obviously am very passionate about traveling and being able to explore new spots. So yeah, I'd appreciate it if you let me know any of your favorite places. But thanks again for watching. I hope you have a fantastic day, and I'll see you in my next video. Have a good one.